Hey, welcome back to Gold Scratch. And so this is the fourth video on this Mike Kimball's budget build. We just published the third video a little while ago, and it's already getting great response. Thank you for that, and getting comments already. And in that video, I covered a whole bunch of points, so I guess I won't cover them over again. What I'm going to do today, I got one piston left to put in. And I wanted to make a video of the process for doing that and show you a few tips. If you're a pro, you probably already know all this, but if you're not, then you might learn something. So before I forget, like and subscribe, please. Subscribers keep me going. And it doesn't cost you anything, but it helps me and everybody else that does YouTube videos as well. That's how it makes it worthwhile for us to keep thinking of ways to provide videos that are practical and helpful. And I don't want to waste your time. I'm going to get the facts covered. We're going to do one piston. One other point I need to make. I talked about the psychic income yesterday. The other point I forgot is this is a Chevrolet small block 350. And we decided to use this. Mike wanted an engine anyway. But we decided to use this as a good practical application to do a video of building a budget engine. But everything we're saying here applies to every small block Chev, every big block Chev, every Ford, every Dodge, Chrysler, whatever. The logic of this doesn't have to be small block Chev. So whatever you're building, the thought process is the same. And so we're going to lead you through that fairly quickly here. This is not going to be a long video. So one of the other points I need to make before you get started any project, get your work area nice and organized. Only the tools and parts you need to do this job should be on your bench, and everything else that's a distraction should be out of your sight so that you don't get confused and make mistakes. One of the issues about putting the piston in is there's 8 of them, and any process that requires repetition is fraught with opportunity for error. So one of the things I try to do, now all the pistons are in except 2, but when I started, I had all 8 of these are just the expansion rings and the oil rings here lined up. And the other rings, when I check the ring end gaps, I leave them right in the piston bore, just in the order that they come out. And you're going to see that in a minute when I put a piston in. So you know exactly where the rings are for that piston. You don't need to go looking for them, because there's nothing worse than if you're just going to take rings out of the package and you get all done and there's one left over, right? What a thought that is. Then you got to go back and find out where you forgot to put one in, taking your pistons back out, whatever. If you leave them organized like this, you can't make that mistake. And I do my best to organize my work in a way that it eliminates mistakes as much as possible. So I'm going to put number 8 piston in, and the reason why there's 2 left here, a couple things. This is a budget build. We're going to try to build this engine for $2,000, but if you're going to do a budget build, you got to be willing to compromise a few little things, right? So one of the things we started off to do, Mike actually bought hyper-eutectic pistons, and one of them didn't look, it was suspect. So that was the decision, one of the old pistons, these are forged piston, and this engine's been rebuilt before. These are aftermarket forged pistons, seal power pistons. But one of them had a little blemish on it, and that was the decision to buy new ones. Then we went and measured the bore clearance, because this engine's clearance for a forged piston, it would have too much clearance for a hyper-eutectic piston. So we decided to go back to the forged pistons and buy one new piston. And so number 4 piston is the one that was suspect, and that's why there's 2 sets of rings left, and number 4 is not in the bore. The other thing, we checked ring end gaps. These are not file fit rings. These are just standard rings. But they're Molly top rings. And ideally, our ring end gap should be around 20 thou, and it's closer to 25, even a little more. It's not perfect, okay? If you want perfect, you can build a $10,000 engine, but it's not going to burn oil. It's going to make good power, and it's not going to have any issues. but that might cost, the end gap might cost us a little bit of power on the dyno. It's going to cause a little more blow by. We're going to actually do a leak down test when we're done. And the extra ring gap, it's not ideal. I'd like it to be 20 thou. It's 25 to 30 thou actually. So we've also measured the distance down the hole, and this one's, they're 25 thou plus or minus. Typically that's what it usually is. This block's obviously never been decked. So I'm going to take number 8 piston, and I'm going to go through the process of installing the rings on it and installing it in the cylinder. Now I have made videos before on this subject, but if you're watching the video about building a budget, you're not going to go looking for that, I don't think. So to make it easy and convenient for you, we're just going to go ahead and do that. So start with our oil rings. They go in first. So I mentioned in the previous video how we mark the piston before we even start, so I know that number 1 end gap for the top piston goes here, and also the spacer, the end gap for the spacer goes in that same quadrant. And this, as you see with these little grooves, they always point up, okay, where they go together in the cylinder bore. So that goes in pretty easy. The oil rings usually is not a problem. I have checked the end gaps for the oil rings as well. And then the 2 little spacer rings, that's what these 2 marks are for. So we start with the bottom one, circle around like this. There we go. That one's pretty good so far. And the top one, like this. Oops. And the oil rings in. Always make sure that they turn freely. Once again, these locations are ideal. You don't have to have it exact. It's not that big of a deal, okay? So the next thing is the second compression ring, which I have here. So when we check end gaps, we leave them in the bore, they're checked. So when they come out, we know which one's which. You don't have to worry about that. I know this is the number 2 ring for number 8 piston. So anytime you do rings, make sure you get it the right way around. So if you look at this very closely, you can see it says top. And this is a cast ring. The second ring is always a cast ring. And the second ring is also partially an oil ring as well. It's a compression ring and an oil ring. And typically it's got a little chamfer on the bottom side, and that's to help push the oil back down into the cylinder. So always check. Sometimes it might be a little dot, sometimes it might be a little stamp, whatever. And it's very, very subtle, not hard to miss it. Always make sure before you start that, and usually the second ring is it's important to get the top where the top goes, because it says that. The top ring, in this case, not always, but in this case, the top ring doesn't matter. It can go either way. It's square. So using this tool, this is my little expander. These are very inexpensive. And some guys put rings in with their fingers. I don't do that, but you can. So when you're expanding it, if you push on this side, it'll help keep the ring in the grooves as you go down and give you a nice clean install. Hopefully I get this one nicely. There we go. Okay, so that's the second ring. Now, another thing to mention, it says top. That doesn't mean it's the top ring. It means it's the top of the second ring. Okay, so I got that in the right place. And where's the top ring? Already in the bore. So this ring is square. There is no top and bottom, so it doesn't matter where it goes. It matters where it goes, but there's no upside down for it. And once again, if I push on this end of the tool and expand it, and it's in there just like that. So I've already marked number 2 ring joint comes on this side of the piston. Number 1 this side, and as I mentioned in the previous video, typically the top gap goes to the passenger side, the second gap goes to the driver's side of the engine. So that's true whether it's on the left side or the right side of the engine. And also there's, in every piston, some indication of which way is front. I put that arrow to make it bigger. I'm not sure if you can see that. There's always a dot or something, and whatever it is, if it's a dot, it always goes towards the front of the engine. So in the previous video, I already checked the clearance of these bearings, so we're not going to go through all that again. We're just going to install it because we know that's good. Assembly lube, so I keep a little bit in a cup like this because out of that Cleveite bottle it's like ketchup. Unless you have it upside down, it takes forever to come out. So this is the way that I have it handy, and don't waste or lose any that way. Okay. So when the piston goes in, number 8, so I think I mentioned this before, there's a chamfer on one side of the rod, and that chamfer goes against the radius of the crankshaft, and the flat part of the rod goes against the other rod. So that's important to remember. So we need to get some oil. The rings are all turning nice and smooth. We've got some oil here. Liberal amount of oil. So the cylinders, one thing I didn't mention, I don't think yesterday or the last video, is the final cleaning process of the cylinder wall. We use brake clean and solvents and all that to get it really clean. And then I actually use Fantastic. Yes, the same stuff you clean your sink in your bathroom with. It works just fine. It's a great grease breaker, and it gives me the final clearing. I think I got a bottle of it right there. And that's how I do the final prep. And then, of course, the cylinders are oiled. Before you start, you have to make sure that the crankshaft is in the right place to receive the rod, so it needs to be just about opposite of where the piston's going in. Okay, and I got this guy upside down now. Okay, now I've got it where it belongs. Okay, so so that it's going to guide in, and then the next thing we do, we put our little booties on. Like everything else, there's an aftermarket product you can buy to do this, or you can use 3/8 fuel line, and that works just fine too. That's all I ever use, and it works okay. So the front is marked to there, the chamfer's on the right side, so I know everything's orientated right. Now, in this case, these pistons haven't been off these rods, at least since the last rebuild. However, if you're putting them together, it's really important to know that. If you're not, it's pretty likely that they're going to be in the right place, because unless they've been in the wrong place all the time they've been in there. So I'm very lucky this time because I have my custom ring compressor for a 4-inch bore. I have 3 or 4 of these, and they're not cheap. I don't have one for every size, but I do have one for this size, and it's definitely a very nice. If you do a lot of 4-inch bore engines, it's definitely nice to have one of these. So it just fits over like this. We slide the piston in through the bore, and then before we do any banging or hammering on the piston, we got to make sure that all the rings are tucked into it. And I have to maybe get down here to do that. There you go. Once it's flush, all the rings are in. Don't start tapping on that. A lot of things I'm going to tell you are from experience, and as my buddy Frank Van de Peer often says, experience is expensive. So if you can learn from my experience, it won't be quite as expensive. So hopefully that helps to see that. So I know the rod's in the right place to receive it. The other important point is make sure your piston is exactly square with the block, pointing straight ahead. Because if it's not, your rod's going to be canted a little bit in there, and there's not much clearance, and your rod could catch on to something on the way down, and that's going to make it hard to get it down. So let's see if this all works. Got to hold this guy down, and there we go. It's down. Keep going until we hear that nice sound. Perfect. Okay, let me just turn it upside down. There we go. Put our pin back in. It doesn't turn on us. Take the booties off. Take our rod cap. Now another way, double check that you can use to make sure you're not getting it in backwards or wrong. When you put both the cap and the rod have a little notch in the bearing, And that notch isn't to keep it from rotating. That notch is just to locate it side to side. That's all it's for. What keeps it from rotating is the crush. When you torque it down, these two faces come together and they crush the bearing into the seat, into the housing, and that's what holds it. But the notch should always be notch to notch. So if you haven't got any other reference, I see the notch on this side, and then to confirm that, the radius is here, the crankshaft radius is here, and that should all go together. Okay, give it a little tap there. There we go. Rod bolts should always be oiled. So I have a little lid full of oil here as well to make sure that they're nicely oiled. Rod bolts. Get them started. There we go. Snug that guy down. And that's just the 20 foot-pounds. Now we do the torquing. So these are SBS rod bolts. So I looked up the spec last night. SBS 47 to 54 foot-pounds of torque, and that gives you 5 to 7 thousandths of an inch of stretch. And these rod bolts, as I mentioned in the previous video, have the little dimple in them, so that if you're using a stretch gauge to measure your rod's stretch, you can do that. So, but we've got, make sure the wrench is set for 50 foot-pounds. Oh, that guy's already there. There we go. I was trying to torque the wrong rod. Hopefully, I don't know if anybody noticed that. And it was already torqued, obviously. And speaking of torques, this is an assembly torque. Before this oil pan goes on, I will retorque every bolt, main bolts, rod bolts, and I'll actually mark that down on the spec sheet, so I don't wake up in the morning and wonder whether I did it or not. So that's the way I deal with that, because that's not a good feeling. So let's see, still turns over nice, and we're good to go. We got a piston in. Okay, one thing I have to correct, when I made the video yesterday, I talked about thrust clearance, and I made a point of setting the thrust bearing with using a rubber hammer on both ends of the crank, and I pointed over here to measure the clearance, and you can do that, but it's tricky because typically the allowable clearance for the thrust bearing is 3 to 11 or 9 thou. The minimum is 3 anyway. And typically on a new bearing and a new job, it's going to be tight. Getting a 3 thou gauge in there is hard. This is the right way to do it. And it's all tightened down now. I'm not going to show you again, but the apparatus I am going to show you is set up there. So you put your dial indicator right in the snout of your crankshaft and you move it back and forth, and that'll give you clearance. I've already done that. I only have 3 thou. I don't have any more than that, but it's okay. It'll be fine. 5 would be nicer, but 3 will work. So I just wanted to show that. And since we looked at the snout, this is a good point to make too. So whoever did this, rebuilt this engine before, take my dial indicator off. So didn't have one of these tools. So what they did was, looks like they used a pipe wrench to turn the crankshaft, and that's what happens to your crankshaft. Now, I've cleaned it up well enough that the harmonic balancer and the timing gear are going to go on there okay. But that's why you need to buy these little kinds of tools. They're not expensive, and you don't need to use a pipe wrench to turn your crankshaft if you do that. So that's one piston installed, and we'll make more videos along the way. It's opportunity when I got somebody to hold the camera and somebody to, get my mic was this year. He produced the last video. And so like and subscribe once again. Hang in there with us. We'll try to make informative videos that'll help you if you want to be a DIY and get the psychic income of firing her up your own engine, we're going to show you all the steps you need to take to do that. Thanks for watching Gold's Garage. Have a good day.